Okay, welcome back to Lecture 6. This is Objective 3, Part 3 of Lecture 6, when we're looking at the factors affecting the likelihood a competitor will take competitive actions. So in our model of competitive rivalry, this fits here, in this area here. You'll notice that the likelihood of attack, which is what we're talking about here, is in Objective 3, is about first mover incentives, organisation size and quality. And Objective 4 is when we're going to look at the likelihood of response. After that, we're going to talk about some of the things here in Objective 5, about both the outcomes of interfirm rivalry and some of the feedback loops that exist. So, let's do some definitions. A competitive action is a strategic or tactical action a firm takes to build or defend its competitive advantage or improve its market position. Now, a strategic action, as we know from earlier in the course, is an action that affects large parts of the organisation, that frequently involves significant resources, that frequently involves a lot of planning and has a long-term focus. A tactical action is not those things. A tactical action can often have a short-term focus, only deal with a small amount of resources, not look at only one part of the organisation or one part of the value chain. So therefore requires a significantly less commitment of resources, and therefore is more likely to occur. So, competitive action is the action the firm takes. Competitive response is the strategic or tactical action the firm takes to counter the effects of a competitor's action. So if we look at the previous slide, we can see there are three types of actions. An action is the likelihood of attack. The three types are first mover incentives. This drives the likelihood of attack. Organisational size influences the likelihood of the attack. And quality influences the likelihood of attack. Now, I want to emphasise when we talk about first mover incentives, we're also going to talk about what's known as second mover incentives. Second mover incentives are firms that follow quite quickly after the first mover has blazed the trail. And there's a whole pile of reasons not to take higher risk first mover action if second mover action can reduce the risk but also achieve similar goals that would otherwise have been achieved just being a first mover. I know in marketing you'd have talked about first mover advantage. It's the same thing, but we're talking about it at a strategic level, so it doesn't have to only be a market-orientated action. So let's start by looking at first mover. First movers allocate funds for things like product innovation and development, aggressive advertising, and advanced research and development. While often first mover advantage is listed as things, or first mover actions are listed as things that only reflect sort of outward facing product, service, advertising, and R&D, they can also include things that include internal processes of the organisation, if in turn those internal processes add value to the customer or increase the ability for the firm to make above average returns and achieve sustainable competitive advantage. So we've talked before about business level strategy and business level strategy of differentiation, the product in innovation development. The research and development is in products and innovation, but in cost led business level strategies, the focus on research and development is in the processes within the value chain and improving the processes in the value chain to reduce the cost or increase efficiency. So first mover advantage can have both of those things. We could think, for example, of the move of airlines to have online direct selling to customers as a cost-focused piece of R&D, a cost-focused first mover example, first mover advantage, an example of first mover advantage, while the development of a new feature on, say, an iPhone is an example of first mover product innovation. Though I'm going to come back a little bit later and talk about first mover advantage, and as you all know, in terms of Apple, I think Apple's more a second mover than a first mover, but we'll come back to that. First movers can gain above average returns because they gain loyalty of customers, because the customers become more committed to their goods and services. And remember, when we talked about commitment to goods and services, when we talked about the advantages that decrease, that make the competencies rare, valuable, hard to imitate, and non-substitutable. And we've talked about barriers to entry in our discussion of the industry environment and the competitive environment. We've talked about loyalty also coming sometimes in a form of forced loyalty, because you're put into an ecosystem where things that are compatible with each other or need to be used only, say, with one iPhone, with one type of phone, with one brand, so you're tied into that brand. And no matter how another firm follows up with that, it's seen as the best. We've also talked about that when manufacturing systems, where you have a system of manufacturing that may have particular packaging machinery, and that packaging machinery might only be compatible with particular size bottles or bottle caps or whatever, and therefore they use the particular types of bottles and the particular types of caps, which means they're committed to a more limited range of resources. We think about that supply chain as a controlling issue, even in the COVID-19 testing fiasco that's happening currently in the US. We have machines that are incompatible with each other, that use different systems, and there is a range of supply chain issues related to things like swabs to collect the testing samples, to the medium which the testing sample has to be stored in, to even the size of the medium that is collected and the nature of the medium that is collected, the nature of the sample that's collected, and how that then goes on to be used in processing. So we have this mismatch of supply chain because these things aren't occurring, which has given some machines an advantage, some processors an advantage when their supply chain is working, and others are at a disadvantage because to use a different test requires a different processor to process your test. So, first mover gives you the advantage of gaining above average returns because the customers are loyal to you, and it makes it difficult for competitors to enter the market. So it takes away future competitive rivalry. Now, the concept of second mover advantage, and what I'm going to do is post an optional video on, which is a video of an extended advertisement of the iPhone, as the Samsung Galaxy 4. We're up to 20 now. The Samsung Galaxy 4 making fun of the iPhone it was competing with, because many of the innovations it already had were not available on the iPhone, but the iPhone at that stage was still outselling Samsung Galaxies because the iPhone was seen as the major smartphone, even though many of the features it got were in fact second mover features after Samsung had pioneered those features in its phones. It's an optional video to watch, in a way, because even though it's funny, it's a counterpoint to first mover advantage. Right, so second mover responds to the first mover's competitive action through imitation or a move designed to counter the effects of that action. Again, in phones, it's when 5G comes out, or when 4G came out, all of a sudden we had 4G plus and 3G plus, just as good as 4G, from the companies that hadn't rolled out their 4G network sufficiently. And we're seeing the same thing with 5G and 4G at the moment. For a long time, 3G was faster than 4G for internet usage because 4G was overcrowded. We're seeing a little bit of the same, that 4G home wireless internet is actually faster than 5G wireless internet at the moment in many areas, because 5G, even though it's there, hasn't been rolled out. So 4G is being touted as something that is as good as 5G. So that's a move designed to counter the effects of the action. But this is what normally happens in a product. A new feature is developed in one company's product. The competitor evaluates the customer's reactions to the product innovations through market research or some other method. Looks at what the advantages are of that, whether it's eating market share, whether it's significant, whether it's something that customers desire, and then tries to find mistakes that the first mover has made, avoid them, and improve the quality. It can also avoid some of the mistakes that the first mover has made, and therefore respond quickly or attack quickly without making investments that have failed for the first mover. And it may develop a more efficient process and technology to be able to deliver that service. So we have in this likelihood of attack as a second mover, real attacks, real products and service innovation, avoiding the issues that the first mover has had, while achieving the same type of positive outcome, getting the benefits that the first mover has achieved. So getting the positives, avoiding the negatives. Or alternatively, it can be a more PR image type strategy where it is trying to nullify the advantage of the first mover by detracting from that first mover's new feature or new features. The criticisms of Zoom everywhere about its security by traditional companies like WebEx, Cisco WebEx. It's all about, Zoom has been the first mover in the brave new world of online meetings in COVID-19. It's benefited enormously, in part by offering free services, but in part and started to eat into the market for online meetings in businesses quite extensively, using a far more efficient and cheaper system than the older proprietary web conferencing systems such as WebEx. Now, WebEx can't match some of the features of Zoom, so it's been highlighting the apparent lack of security of Zoom because, shock of shock, people share passwords to meetings. I'm not sure how that's much different to WebEx. You can share a password on an email to a WebEx meeting as well. You don't actually need a link. But the WebEx, because it's a proprietary system and you have to actually always log in as the company person, as the person with a company email, it does have some level of high security, but they're focusing on that as they develop something that will compete directly with Zoom, which has come to the market just in the last couple of days. which offers some of the flexibilities that Zoom has, which WebEx didn't have. Okay, there's the third type of mover, is the late mover. The late mover responds to competitive actions only after a considerable time has elapsed. While first movers and second movers have more likelihood of achieving sustainable competitive advantage and above average returns, by responding late, any success achieved will be slow in coming and much less than the first or second movers if you're a late mover. So you can only achieve average returns, and it delays the understanding of how to create value for customers. When people talk about strategy, though, they keep missing out one of the key issues in this description. It misses out one of the key issues, and that's the word successful. Sometimes innovations of first and second movers are not successful. They actually come up with something that is not valued by the customer, or can be leapfrogged later. So sometimes late movers are de facto seen as incredibly intelligent because the first and second mover have gone into a downward spiral of competition, and that's affected their profitability and their ability to sustain competitive advantage, or they've offered something that the customer is unwilling to value. And the late mover, even though they haven't made early returns, may be the last company standing. The second thing that influences the likelihood of attack is organisation size. Large firms are more likely to initiate competitive actions that are strategic during any given time period. This is in part because they tend to have greater resources to be able to devote to competitive action. Those slack resources enable them to pursue more than one competitive action at a time, and where they focus those strategic and tactical actions can be across a broad range of activities in the firm. So they can initiate a number of small tactical actions, or a group of small tactical actions that form a strategic action, or they can in fact launch a strategic action because of those slack available resources. Small firms are more likely to launch competitive actions and be quicker at doing them. So size has sort of this curvilinear effect. One set of advantages is there for large firms, and the other set of advantages is there for small firms. So small firms can be nimble and flexible. They can rely on speed and surprise, and they can sometimes enter the market and be at a particular point as a first mover before the large firm has noticed them. And they have greater flexibility needed to launch a variety of competitive actions. So if we think about, let's think about Telstra and Optus. When Telstra is a member of the International Telecommunications Union, Telstra is what's called a legacy carrier. It used to be that every country had one phone carrier, or a small number of phone carriers, that were owned by the government, or in the case of the US, owned by the private sector. And that carrier was a member of the International Telecommunications Union that came up with agreements around the world about how telecommunications would work. As part of the process to globalize and liberalize and create competition within telecommunications some 20 years ago, most markets opened themselves up to having multiple carriers, and it also coincided with the release of phone spectrum as well. So mobile carriers as well. So Optus entered the market owned by a consortium, one foreign telecommunications company, a transportation company, and an investment company. And they were the nimble, fast-moving, smaller competitor competing against Telstra's large legacy carrier that owned the copper wires, that had the large customer base. Eventually, Singapore, the company Singtel, which is owned by the Singaporean government, bought Optus. The advantages that Singtel got from purchasing Optus was it gave it access to a nimble company, and the learnings from that nimble company, Optus, enabled it to understand how non-legacy carriers behaved and to counter some of the pressures it was feeling in its home market from the companies that had been allowed to enter the Singapore market. It also enabled them to replicate some of the things Optus was doing as Singtel expanded internationally into other markets. The advantage that Optus got was suddenly they had access to a legacy carrier that wasn't as big as Telstra, but still bigger than they were. A legacy carrier that had all the knowledge and information and Slack resources that were related to big strategy. It had been operating as a national and then regional carrier. So the joining of Optus with Singtel gave them the advantages of both, the organisational advantages of both being a large firm able to initiate strategic actions and a small, nimble firm able to launch competitive and tactical actions. Right, the third factor that influences the likelihood of attack that is speed. Smaller firms tend to be able to act more quickly for competitive actions than larger firms. So this is the actions that fit within organisational size. So smaller firms tend to be able to act more quickly, and speed in developing and innovating, however, can sometimes, in terms of bringing it to market across a number of competitive actions, a number of strategic actions, depends on the size of the firm. There's a strong link between speed to market and competitive advantage, particularly in the 21st century, in a globalised world. It's becoming increasingly important. Innovation is also a contributor to the likelihood of attack. The ability of the firm to innovate and develop new products and services, or innovate within its production process, is linked to above average returns and sustainable competitive advantage. Either you're improving the focus if you're following a cost, or your pricing performance and your costing performance if you're following a cost leadership or cost focused business level strategy, or you are enabling your product to be differentiated if you're following a mass differentiation or focused differentiation strategy. And of course, we've got the hybrid strategies as well. When we look at synergies between different parts of a corporation, they can also contribute to the sharing of innovation, which can also affect speed. And obviously, large corporations that are working on a related diversification strategy can share resources and capabilities, which will affect the speed to market and innovation. Final area to consider here is quality. No matter how fast, no matter how large, no matter how innovative a company is, quality, or the perception of quality, is an important, critical factor in whether your organisation performs or does not perform. There are two dimensions of quality: perceived product quality and perceived service quality. Many products are actually, or many products are sold as a combined product or service, so they might emphasize one or the other. An iPhone is in fact a combined product and service, because not only are you buying the physical phone and all its style, but you're also buying the software ecosystem that iPhone has, and the service that software and that walled garden of whatever iTunes is now called, and all those types, Safari, and all those type of software resources that are unique to Apple, its App Store. All those things form part of the service that builds on that product, even though some of the apps you could also describe as product. What are the dimensions of quality? So how do people perceive quality? It's the performance of the product or service. It's the features and special characteristics of that product or service. It's whether it meets operating specifications over a period of time, and its durability before performance deteriorates. And sometimes, as we've seen with iPhone, they were deliberately deteriorating the quality of the battery to get people to, in fact, purchase a new iPhone. Now, they've actually reversed that and paid compensation to companies just recently, but that's one of their strategies, planned performance deterioration. Whether the product conforms to pre-established standards. So all Android phones, even though they may have different different operating systems, run on Android. They all have common features. They all have certain common standards. 5G, 4G is a common standard that phones need to have to be able to operate on particular networks. The ease and speed of repair, the aesthetics, how the product looks and feels, and the perceived quality, the subjective assessment of the characteristics and the product image. And if we think again about Apple and Samsung, and Apple and Google, how those phones and how those services are perceived differently by different groups of people, we can see the dimensions of quality across all those areas. So what's service? Service is about service being done in a timely period, in the promised period of time. It's about courtesy or positive relationships, and it's about consistency, that all customers get similar experience each time they need service and support. It's about convenience, it's about completeness, and it's about accuracy of the process. You don't want to take your car somewhere and then have to continuously bring it back and have to argue with the support staff when it has a minor problem under warranty. The reason that we have both Apple the reason that we have Apple stores, as distinct from just Apple retailing elsewhere, is because they wanted to create a unified concept of quality service for their products, which are seen as premium quality products. Well, Samsung stores don't do service in the store. Samsung's flagship stores send the phone away to be serviced. Different concept of service and support. Okay, so that's objective 3. We'll take a break now. I will throw up that other video just as something that's a little bit of a light break. And what I'd like you to do also is consider Prius and the market that we've seen in the rise and fall of Prius against the issues that we've just raised in objective 3. After you've done that, we'll come back and look at objective 4, which is the likelihood a competitor will respond to actions taken against it.